So I wish everybody who celebrates Easter over this weekend a very happy Easter. I would also say that what has made this Easter especially happy for me and for my colleague Alex Christoforou, and I'm sure for many others of you, is the fact that our friend Gonzalo Lira, who came under detention in Ukraine on the 15th of April and who was for several days not heard of, causing concern amongst many people, ourselves included, is now safe and well. And in fact, yesterday, which was Good Friday, by the way, in the Orthodox Easter calendar, he participated in our programs on the Duran. He did a program with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, confirming the fact of his safety and release. And he also did a live stream, which I find extraordinary and a high testament to his extraordinary resilience and mental energy. And can I also say that I wish Gonzalo and his family the very best, and I'm very happy and very delighted that he's with us again. Well, this is going to be a program again, I'm afraid, about the situation in and around Ukraine, but I'm going to focus mainly on the important economic news. Now, saying this, I will do what I generally do at the start of these programs, which is take a brief and quick overview of the military situation. Now, in doing so, I will repeat my traditional warning. I'm not a military expert. I'm not somebody who has a great understanding of these matters. I've never served in any military, and I've never shown much interest in the past in military matters. So what I say always has to be taken with that qualification in mind. Also, it's perhaps important to add that this being Easter, and many of the people who are involved in providing us with up-to-date information of what is happening on the ground in Russia and Ukraine, being Orthodox Christians, Russia and Ukraine being predominantly Orthodox countries. Many of them are currently on leave, and that, of course, has slowed further the amount of information that we're getting. Nonetheless, there is a certain amount of information. Firstly, it's now clear that Azovstal, the steelworks in Mariupol, is essentially sealed off. The Russians have decided that they're not going to storm it. That was an order made by President Putin himself. I discussed that in my previous video. But it's also clear that shelling and bombing of the steelworks still continues. And the Russians have repeatedly said that they're willing to allow whoever is still in the steelworks, both military and civilians. There's growing discussion about whether or not there are civilians in the Azovstal steelworks. The men of the Azov battalion who are there insist there are, and are providing pictures of people who they say are these civilians. I think it's entirely plausible that there could be, by the way, and I'm going to speculate that they're principally family members of those soldiers. But anyway, the Russians have said that all of these people are able, if they so choose, to surrender, to come out of the steelworks under white flags. And if they are, their protection, their safety is guaranteed by the Russian army. And we're having from the Azov battalion, by contrast, increasingly plaintive and desperate videos asking for their own evacuation and for the evacuation of these civilians from the steelworks. Now, yesterday, I got an updated report from, one of the numerous websites that covers these matters, and which does seem, it's a Russian website, does seem to have some access to some official information, that the Russians believe that there is in the underground tunnels and bunkers beneath the steelworks around 2 weeks of supplies of food and presumably water, which presumably provides a time limit to how much longer these troops can hold out for. I would say if they are able to listen to this broadcast, which of course perhaps they can't, and I would say to them, better to do what the Russians say. I don't think there's any real prospect of the Russians loosening their grip on the Azovstal steelworks. I don't think there's any real prospect of the Russians allowing these troops to withdraw to Ukrainian territory. And I think this idea of these troops being reassigned to a third country, I suspect that's probably a non-starter, though you never know. But one way or the other, it seems to me that especially if there are civilians there, some of whom seem to be children, then the duty of the commanders of the force in the Azovstal steelworks is to prioritize the safety of those civilians, and I would add the safety of their own men. I see no value in pointless sacrifices. Azovstal is now sealed off. Since the Russians are not going to storm it, they're reassigning many of their assault troops away from the Azovstal steelworks, from Mariupol, in fact, to other places along the front line. And I think that the better policy, the better strategy, is to simply accept the reality that Mariupol is lost. It's purely symbolic to pretend that the Ukrainians are still defending it, and nothing is ever achieved by these kind of symbolic gestures. And in light of this, the better thing to do is to put aside fantasies about Thermopylae, which is based on a misunderstanding of history anyway, to leave, if you like, Valhalla to Wotan, and to do what is sensible, proper, humane, and right, and to accept the Russian terms of surrender. And I hope this advice is heeded, though I'm afraid, realistically, I doubt that it will be. Anyway, elsewhere in Donbass, what we're hearing is of enormous amounts of shelling by the Russian military of Ukrainian formations, military groups in and around Donbass. And we also got, over the course of Thursday, the first admissions in the media, in Britain at least, and from the British government, that things may not be going terribly well. So firstly, we had an article in the London Times. Now, the London Times, if you remember, is the newspaper which back in March was the first newspaper in Britain, and practically the first media outlet in the West to accept that the overriding priority of the Russian military was to encircle Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, not to storm Kiev, which is where all the attention was at that time. So the London Times is clearly well briefed and well informed by serious people within the British intelligence community. And of course, what it says is always said with care. And obviously, there's always a wish to try to maintain the pretense of heroic Ukrainian resistance. But on this occasion, it's now published an article on Thursday which appeared to acknowledge that Russia is actually winning in Ukraine. It's behind a paywall, but I will for once, as this is a very short article, read it out. And it says, the title is Ukraine War, Revitalize Russia Can Still Win, Western Intelligence Warns. And then the article goes on to say President Putin could still win the war in Ukraine, which is now expected to last until the end of the year, Western officials said. The Russian army outnumbers Ukrainian forces in the east 3-1 and could encircle and destroy a significant proportion, the officials warned. They said Russia could even launch a new assault on Kiev or deprive the Ukrainian capital of access to the Black Sea in a worst-case scenario. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Western intelligence suggests that Moscow has made tactical adjustments after its troops were humiliated. The word humiliated is in quotation marks. I don't accept that qualification, but never mind. In the first 2 months of the invasion. The main theatre of the war in the eastern Donbass region is flat with firm terrain which offers Russian artillery and tanks an advantage compared with the forests north of Kiev. Russia has appointed an experienced commander to oversee Russia's special military operation. General Alexander Dvornikov led the intervention in Syria, where he ordered the flattening of Aleppo and helped President Assad to remain in power. Dvornikov is trying to orchestrate a pincer movement with Russian forces pushing south from Kharkiv and north from Lugansk. There is a real possibility Russia could surround Ukrainian forces and grind them down over time, which would be enough for Putin to claim it as a win, one official said, consolidating control over the Donbass and Crimea, and could be seen as a success. Well, can I just say, there's lots that I take issue with. I don't accept that the Russians were humiliated in the first 2 months of the war. I think this is all based upon the legend, if you like, of the heroic defense of Kiev, which, as I said, as people who followed my channel will know, I never took entirely seriously. And as for the appointment of General Alexander Dvornikov, well, there's been a lot about this in the Western media. There's been absolutely nothing about it from the Russian side. My understanding is that General Dvornikov is the commander of the Russian 58th Army Group, which has been one of the key formations conducting this campaign all along, and that he has, in effect, always been the main battlefield commander in most of the fighting in Donbass. I think this claim that he was suddenly appointed to overall strategic command over the Russian military in Ukraine is another case of, well, frankly, misreporting. But anyway, the essential point about this article is that it is an admission that Russia could win. And it is also an admission that the Russians could encircle and destroy a large part of the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine. This is, of course, Ukraine's best army, and that the terrain favors this and that they heavily outnumber the Ukrainians in this theatre. So that's an interesting set of admissions. And of course, we also have the very interesting admissions, or rather comment, about depriving the Ukrainian capital, that's Kiev, of access to the Black Sea in what is described as a worst-case scenario. Let's hold on to that in a moment. Anyway, that article came out on Thursday, and it came out as news began to trickle through of the situation in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainians admitted that the Russians, over the course of Thursday, captured 42 villages in Donbass, which is, by the way, a great deal many more than the Russians have claimed, and that their advanced troops are now very close to the town of Liman, which is part of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk defense perimeter, and that they've also managed to clear completely the city of Rubizhnoye, which is tightening the trap around the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk agglomeration. And it seems that the Russians are also making significant advances, or rather, I should say, the militia, the Donbass militia, which is actually fighting this area, is actually making significant advances in another important North Donbass town, which is Popaznaya. So all of this, together with the news from Mariupol, seems to have led to this article. And a few hours later, we had a statement from the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who, by the way, is in severe political difficulties and who has been on a trip to India, that Russia might indeed win in Ukraine. And the Financial Times, which covered the story, said that this is the first admission by a Western leader of the possibility of a Russian victory in Ukraine. Now, that I think was an important step by Boris Johnson. I would point out that Boris Johnson was the Western leader who said that a Russian advance into Ukraine, he said this before the war, must not only fail, but be seen to fail, and that he was instrumental, apparently, in advising the Ukrainians, or rather pressuring the Ukrainians, to retract all the very important concessions they made to the Russians in the negotiations in Istanbul a month ago. So if Boris Johnson now admits that the Ukrainians could indeed lose in this war, leaving them in a very difficult situation indeed, well, I think he needs to examine his own conscience and ask himself whether perhaps some of his own actions might have brought Ukraine to this particular juncture. In Istanbul last month, it did seem as if substantive progress was being made in the negotiations. Boris Johnson, as I said, played a significant role in torpedoing that progress in the negotiations. He called on Ukraine to take a hard line, and now he's admitting, on the contrary, that Ukraine might lose, leaving Ukraine in a far worse position, if it does lose, than it would have been in if it had progressed with the negotiations on the basis of the concessions it made last month in Istanbul. So I think Boris Johnson, perhaps needs to revisit his conscience and perhaps, assuming he has any, which is doubtful actually, and also perhaps start changing his advice, the advice he gives to his Ukrainian friends. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. Let's return to this supposed worst case scenario outlined in the Times, which is that the Russians could even launch a new assault on Kiev or deprive the Ukrainian capital, that's to say Kiev, of access to the Black Sea. Well, that came a few hours after the Russian news agency TASS published the words of a senior Russian military officer, Major General Rustam Minekayev. And Rustam Minekayev, we are informed, is the deputy commander of Russia's Central Military District. And he was speaking at an event in Yekaterinburg where he was addressing the annual meeting of the Union of Defense Industry Enterprises of the Sverdlov region. Now, the Central Military District is not a place where the Russians is not directly, as I understand it, participating in this military campaign, but it is the center of Russia's military-industrial complex. To give an example, the giant factory at Nizhny Tagil, which produces most of Russia's tanks, is located there, and of course there's a large number of other major industrial enterprises in the Sverdlovsk region, in and around Yekaterinburg, in the Urals, which ever since the Second World War have been a major part of Russia's military industries. Anyway, this is what General Minekayev is reported by the Russian news agency TASS, which is, of course, Russia's official news agency, as having said to the heads of these enterprises. he said, control of over Donbass will enable us to establish a ground corridor to Crimea and to gain influence over the vitally important Ukrainian military facilities, the Black Sea ports, which serve deliveries of agricultural and metallurgical products to other countries. And TASS then went on to say that Minakayev added that the special military operation must be successfully accomplished and that all set tasks would be achieved. We did not start this war, but we will put an end to it, he added. So that appears to confirm what Alex Christoforou and I have been saying in various programs, that the major Russian objectives are in eastern Ukraine, control of Donbass, potentially control of Kharkiv region in the north, but crucially that they have no intention of withdrawing from the territories they've captured in Zaporozhye region and in Kherson region, and that they might in fact go on to consolidate control of a belt of territory linking Donbass all the way to Crimea. And there's already apparently some talk of reorganizing all this territory as part of an enlarged Crimean region. Elsewhere, there's further reports, this is from the Russian version of TASS, in which General Minakayev apparently indicated that the Russians were also looking to link up with their forces in Transnistria in Moldova. Transnistria is a region in Moldova with a large Russian-speaking minority. There's a Russian military forces actually in Transnistria, which are protecting, if you like, or occupying, if you prefer the Moldovan point of view, part of this territory, and the people who live there. And the Russians are, according to General Minakayev, interested in protecting this region, and he seemed to be indicating that the Russians might indeed be looking to extend their areas of control all the way up to Transnistria, in effect taking control of the entire Black Sea coast of Ukraine, including the key ports of Nikolaev and Odessa, both, by the way, overwhelmingly Russian-speaking. And that would indeed cut off Kiev and Ukraine from the sea, what the London Times said was a worst-case scenario. Now, the Kremlin has refused to comment on General Minakayev's statements, but note that these words appear on the official news agency, the official Russian news agency, TASS, and as a result, one must assume that they're being given the official stamp of approval. It seems to me that General Minakayev was given the green light to say these things at this meeting in Yekaterinburg with the various chiefs of the big industrial plants there. And then there was a decision made from on high to publish these comments on TASS, to transmit them to the world, and perhaps more practically to the people in Kiev. It seems to me that what the Russians are doing is that they're giving the Ukrainians a warning. They're saying to the Ukrainians, look, we've made our demands clear. At the moment, when we spoke in Istanbul, our demands were Donbass and Crimea, your neutrality, and steps to protect the position of Russian speakers in what will be left of Ukraine. But you retracted, you pulled back from all your promises, so now that's no longer enough. We want control of Kherson region and Zaporozhye as well. And we've taken steps now to establish our own administrations in these regions. Most of the administrative buildings there are now flying Russian flags. The ruble is now being used as the main currency. And moreover, we are pressing very hard on your troops in Nikolaev. They are constantly under relentless bombing and shelling and missile strikes by our military. And in fact, latest reports suggest that the Russians have actually been edging closer towards Nikolaev. And we are not going to withdraw from these territories that we control, because they are already vital to our security and to the long-term security of Crimea. But if you don't negotiate now, if you don't actually come to an agreement with us now, then we will press on further. We will move forward. We will take Nikolaev. We will eventually capture Odessa. And at that point, you will be completely cut off from the sea. So better for you to negotiate now, to come to a deal with us now, instead of holding out, hoping against hope that something might turn up, that something might turn out which could turn the situation for you. Well, I'm not sure that the Ukrainians are listening, but I suspect that is probably the long-term plan. Now, I'm going to make another quick observation about the military fighting in Donbass. I think that the Russians will probably hold back most of their main forces until they've cracked the outline defenses around these key towns of Slavyansk, and Kramatorsk, just as they've done, that's to say Popaznaya, Krasny Liman or Liman, and all of these other places. There's some talk, by the way, that the Ukrainians are now thinking of withdrawing some of their troops, or their troops from the town of Severodonetsk, which is essentially surrounded. May be difficult to do, by the way. But anyway, I think what the Russians will do is that they will hold back a large part of their forces until the forces in Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Severodonetsk have been defeated. And then we will start to see a major Russian offensive, an armored offensive across central Ukraine, all the way to places like Nikolaev and Odessa, cutting off most of northern Ukraine from the Black Sea. I think that's probably the Russian plan. I'm not a strategist. I'm not somebody who understands these things well. But looking at the maps, looking at the way things are going, that, it seems to me, is the plan. Now, whether or not I'm right, I don't know. The General Staff doesn't share its views with me, but it seems to me that that's the direction of events. And what I'm also hearing, by the way, is that Ukrainian losses over the last couple of days have been spiking and are becoming horrendous, and that as Ukraine finds itself confronting the possibility of the encirclement of its forces in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and Severodonetsk and all those other places, it's throwing more and more troops to try and hold the Russian advance south of Izium and in Popaznaya. And more of these troops apparently are reservists and are finding it difficult to fight the professional Russian army, and the result is massive losses. Losses running into the hundreds every day, hundreds of killed, more wounded. And if this is true, then it's debatable, it seems to me, how much longer the Ukrainians will be able to keep this up. But if that is a fair assessment of the direction of the battle, then it seems to me that the Ukrainians, in their own interests, need to revisit the negotiations quickly. As we've seen, Boris Johnson has somewhat changed his tune about their prospects, and maybe this time, if they start to negotiate seriously, they will save more of what is left than they would do if they held out for longer. Anyway, that's my own personal view. I would add that as things are turning sour in eastern Ukraine, we've seen Western governments trying to step up arms supplies to Ukraine. The United States is now sending 90 towed 155 millimeter howitzers with 180,000 rounds of ammunition to eastern Ukraine, or rather to Ukraine. There's commitments from Canada, Belgium, and a number of other countries also to send artillery. It's interesting that the focus now is on artillery rather than tanks and such things. Though Boris Johnson has come up with a scheme for Britain to send Challenger tanks to Poland, and for the Poles in return to send their T-72, their Soviet-built T-72 tanks, to Ukraine to replace Ukrainian losses. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, has said that these replacements are going to be nowhere near enough to change the tide of the battle. And in fact, I am sure he is right. The Russians, for their part, have made another important statement today about their fears about false flags. They've picked up on all this dramatic talk in the West about Russia possibly using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. The Russians have categorically denied this, but they've said that they are concerned that the West is floating these ideas. People in the West are floating these ideas in preparation for some kind of false flag event. And they've suggested that one false flag event this is what the Russians are saying, was planned for Azovstal, which has been thwarted by the Russian decision not to storm the steelworks, but that there's also plans to carry out some kind of other incident with chemicals in some other part of Ukraine, and that there's a worst case possibility of some kind of tactical nuclear weapons use in the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk region. Well, I sincerely and devoutly hope that the Russians are wrong about all of this, or if they are not wrong, that whoever is coming up with these disastrous thoughts in the West is thinking carefully about them and is pulling back from doing them. Because, to be straightforward about it, use of these sort of weapons by either side in this war would be an absolute catastrophe. It would risk an almost uncontrolled escalation if it were to happen. Anyway, that seems to me the general picture with the military situation. Perhaps more interesting and more revealing is what we're learning about the capitulation of the Europeans to Putin's gas for rubles demand. Now, this is a complex story, but if you go back to March, way back in March, Vladimir Putin said that the Russians could no longer continue to demand, could no longer accept euros and dollars in return for their gas, because Western countries had shown that they were prepared to freeze use of any euros or dollars that they paid to the Russians, and this risked that the Russians would be supplying gas to the Europeans for free, which is obviously improper and indeed inconceivable. So what Putin proposed was that there should be a gas for rubles deal. And the idea was that the gas for rubles deal would take the form of Western companies, European companies, buying gas from Russia, opening accounts at Gazprom Bank, which is one of the big Russian banks, which has not so far been de-SWIFTed. Gazprom Bank would open corresponding accounts with these Western companies, ruble accounts. Gazprom Bank would receive these payments in euros and dollars from the Western companies, convert them into rubles, pay the rubles into the corresponding accounts of these companies, and the money, the rubles, would then be paid to Gazprom. Now, that was the proposal. And I remember back in March, there was a huge outrage. There were brave statements made from all European countries that they were not going to, apart from Hungary, by the way, that they were not going to agree to this. Olaf Scholz angrily said that Germany would never succumb to this sort of blackmail. They would absolutely refuse to pay in rubles for their gas. And this was very much the position that the European governments took. And of course, the European Commission also went forward and actually issued a advice to all European states that, in fact, agreeing to Putin's gas for rubles proposal would violate the existing sanctions. And then a few weeks ago, we were getting further reports that the Europeans were also contemplating a energy ban, an import ban on Russian oil, which is accounts for about a third, by the way, of Europe, or between a quarter of a third of Europe's oil imports. And we were reading all sorts of claims that the European Union had prepared a draft proposal for an import ban on Russian oil, and that this was going to be delayed until after the French presidential election, but that it would then be green-lighted in a few days after the French presidential election. The reason for the delay was that the Europeans didn't want to do anything that might help Marine Le Pen win the election by causing oil prices to spike. Well, all those brave words, and what we've now seen is a series of what look like retractions and retreats. Firstly, we had no less a person than the US Secretary of State, Janet Yellen, again on Thursday, saying that an import ban on Russian energy would not be a good idea. What she said was Europe clearly needs to reduce its dependence on Russia with respect to energy, but we need to be careful when we think about a complete European ban on, say, oil products. Notice that she refers here to oil products. That would clearly raise global oil prices. It would have a damaging impact on Europe and on other parts of the world. And counterintuitively, it could actually have very little negative impact on Russia, because although Russia might export less, the price it gets for its exports would go up. So there's Yellen saying, hold on a moment, maybe an import ban on Russian oil would not be such a good idea after all. And the same, presumably, of course, is true of gas. And then we got a further comment from the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy, Josep Borrell, and he also said that the ideas about an import ban on Russian oil had been shelved for the moment because several countries had indicated that this was not something that they were prepared to do at this time. And then we got further confirmation that the EU Commission has now provided a further advisory message, which has been circulating to all European countries, in which it has said that actually, if provided European companies pay for gas in euros, paying that money to Gazprom Bank, then if Gazprom Bank converts that money into rubles and pays it into a corresponding account of a ruble account of those companies held by Gazprom Bank, and that money is then forwarded on to Gazprom, well, that wouldn't actually breach the sanctions after all. And by the way, the British government is now essentially saying the same thing. Britain has actually sanctioned Gazprom Bank, but they've actually given a waiver to British gas companies up to the 31st of May to actually exercise precisely this procedure, use precisely this procedure. Now, what I find fascinating is that there's been a certain amount of media commentary about this. It hasn't been hugely publicised. But if you read accounts of the EU's advice, for example, on Reuters, if you look at the EU documents, if you read what other Western media are saying about this, you will find one notable absence. Not one of them is acknowledging that this is in fact what the EU Commission is now proposing is in fact identical in every respect, in absolutely every respect, to Vladimir Putin's original gas for ruble scheme. So what Alex Christoforou and I were saying back in March, that eventually the Europeans, left with no other options, needing gas, needing Russian gas, needing to continue to import Russian gas to keep their citizens warm through the winter and to keep their factories running. Ideas of importing vast amounts of liquefied natural gas from the United States are proving impractical in the short term. Ideas of importing more gas from Qatar and Algeria, as I've discussed in various programs on this channel and on the Duran, those ideas have turned to dust. The Europeans have been forced, in other words, to do what Alex Christoforou and I said they would do. They are accepting President Putin's gas for ruble scheme. And I'm going to go further. I'm going to say that having made that decision, it's only a question of time before the Russians take a further step beyond the existing scheme. They will say at some point, I'm not sure when, to the Europeans, look, if you still want to buy our gas, you're saying you don't want to, but if you still want to buy our gas, we're prepared to sell it to you, but we're going to do it in our own currency. We're not going to go through these elaborate processes at Gazprom Bank. That's something we did up to now because the original contracts specified that payment had to be made in euros. But any new contracts, payment must be in rubles. In other words, you must buy the rubles from us and use those rubles which you buy from us to pay us for our gas. So that's, it seems to me, where we're heading. Now, on oil, if one takes Josep Borrell seriously, which I scarcely ever do, by the way, then it looks as if the idea of an import ban on Russian oil has been shelved, at least at the moment. And certainly that's Janet Yellen's advice. I would add that, in my opinion, the reason Janet Yellen is advising the Europeans to row back on the oil import ban is that the administration, the US administration, is now becoming extremely nervous about the impact of higher oil prices on political opinion in the United States and on the electoral prospects of the Democrats in the November midterms. So she's essentially telling the Europeans, don't do this. We can't afford higher oil prices at the moment. That could tip us all into recession, and it could cause us major political difficulties going forward in the November midterms. I'm also going to say something else, which is I suspect that there are some people in the United States who are becoming increasingly alarmed at what is happening to the US's strategic oil reserve. A few weeks ago, President Biden having failed to persuade the Saudis and the Gulf oil states to increase oil production, decided that he would start releasing oil from the US's strategic reserve with the intention of reducing oil prices, global oil prices. In practice, what has been happening is that as the Europeans have been edging towards an import ban on Russian oil, that oil that the United States has been releasing from its strategic reserve has increasingly found its way to Europe, which of course leaves less oil in the United States, putting an upward pressure on fuel prices, oil prices in the United States itself. Moreover, as I discussed previously, the amount of oil that President Biden is releasing from the strategic reserve is on such a scale that it is bringing down that strategic reserve to critically low levels. In fact, at the end of this process, there will be actually very little oil left in that strategic reserve, which could put the United States in a rather awkward position, a very difficult position, if things turn out badly in the autumn and winter. So I think that people like Yellen and perhaps other people within the US government are becoming increasingly concerned. And they're saying to the Europeans, for heaven's sake, slow down. This isn't such a good idea after all. You're not really going to hurt the Russians. The Russians will have no difficulty selling their oil, even at a discount, even if they have to sell it at a discount. Oil prices are rising so much. If you do this, they will always find some buyers for their oil, given the critically tight oil market which we already have. All you're going to do is undermine the stability of the Western economies, cause all sorts of political problems, and perhaps beyond that, there are private worries in the United States that the United States is running down to critical levels its own strategic reserves. So, logically, hearing this kind of advice from, well, Janet Yellen, after all, the Treasury Secretary of the United States, the major Western economy, you would have thought that the Europeans would have decided, well, maybe this import ban on Russian oil is not something we're going to do after all. That certainly seems to be what you would have expected governments like Germany, Austria, and the others to do. Well, Josep Borrell seems to have said that, in fact, the idea of an import ban on Russian oil has been put aside. I'm not so sure. I think it's quite possible in this atmosphere we have in Europe that we will in fact see an import ban on Russian oil. Perhaps they'll try and massage or find a way around the problem by delaying its full implementation by a few months. I don't think that's going to help with the oil price at all. I think oil prices would then spike anyway. But, given the hysteria of the moment, perhaps that's what we're going to see. Regardless of whether we see it or not, this whole episode, the fact that there's been this capitulation to Putin over the gas for rubles deal, and the fact that even Janet Yellen is saying an import ban on Russian oil is a bad idea, slow down on that. Well, all of this shows once again that all of these plans, all these strategies, all these sanction strategies that were embraced by the Western powers back in February and which evolved and gained extra force throughout March have simply not been thought through. Well, one day maybe, I'm not saying that the Europeans have to forever buy Russian oil and Russian gas and Russian coal. It seems to me to make logical commercial sense for them to do so, but If they choose not to, well, I suppose that's their affair. But if they're going to go down that road, they need to think hard about the energy transition. And building windmills, realistically, is not going to do it. And building nuclear power stations takes a very long time and encounters massive political difficulties. And building liquefied natural gas stations and all that is possible, but it's expensive and it takes a lot of time, and there may not be that much liquefied natural gas anyway around. So if you're going to do this sort of thing, you need to think it through carefully. You need to prepare, you need to plan, you need to give your people, your engineers and your specialists a long lead time, 10, perhaps even 20 years, in order to do it. It can be done, but to think that it can all just be done in a few months is foolishness. However, I'm far from convinced that that foolishness has fully dissipated. In which case, despite the wise words of Janet Yellen, and despite the capitulation by the EU on Putin's gas for rubles proposal, we could still be facing much higher energy costs this autumn and winter, with the prospect of further disruptions in the months and years ahead. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. Remember, you can find us on various platforms, including, obviously, Locals and Rumble, which I discussed at the start of this program, but that you can find us on other platforms too. Please remember that you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the various wonderful things that you will find there, including our great magic mugs and t-shirts and hoodies and all the rest. And thank you again for joining me. If you want to support us and show some support for me on this channel, well, remember to press the like button if you've liked this video and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. Have a good Easter and more from me soon. And in the meantime, have a very good day.